Hey guys, Hashi here, and today I wanted to talk about the biggest retcon in Warhammer's history. Now I'm sure many people think I'm talking about the recent kerfuffle with the 10th edition Custodes Codex and its clarification that Custodes can be female, and in fact have always been female if we take the lore to its absolute limit there. But no, I don't really think that's a retcon for one, because in the past Aaron Dembski-Bowden, a Black Library author, has stated that he tried to introduce female Custodes, but was rejected, not because the lore contradicted it, but because the models at the time, which were new, did not have female representation, and they didn't want lore without models. The retcon I'd like to talk about today is the timeline rollback that was done for Warhammer 40,000's 5th edition. To some people, this may come as a shock, since there's always been this myth that Warhammer was super static at the end of the 41st millennium. But as we will see in this video, that is not the case. At the end of the video, you'll understand where I'm coming from and why I believe this is truly the biggest retcon in Warhammer history. To begin this tale, we must take ourselves back to the ripe old year of 2000, where in White Dwarf 247 we are told about the incoming Third War for Armageddon. Now I don't intend to cover the entire Third War, recap the in real life campaign or anything like that. I'm just trying to get across that this global campaign happened, and that Games Workshop themselves said they would rewrite the background based on the results of this campaign. And they say this in White Dwarfs 247 and 248. In White Dwarf 248, we would get a ton of lore on the lead up to the Third War, and establish the various sectors and players that would be fighting for it. For those who are new to Warhammer, the premise behind the campaign is that you would play games of Warhammer 40,000 or one of its sub-games like Battlefleet Gothic, and then submit your results to Games Workshop like this. Like I said before, I don't intend to recap the whole campaign. I'm sure others would do a much better job of that, considering I'm more of a fictional cosmologist than I would be a fictional historian. So if you're interested in cosmology, you should check out my blog. Anyways, the campaign would end in a draw, with fighting continuing on the planet's surface per the campaign's official website. The results were also published in White Dwarf issue 251, although they don't do that for every campaign, but that's a rant we will get to later. I should also note that this issue of White Dwarf is the one where we were told that Captain Tycho of the Blood Angels fucking dies, and get this, the sector that's represented by Warhammer World. Needless to say, this didn't stick, as he still has rules to this day, with following editions weirdly referring to what happened. Like here's his next rule update that we see in White Dwarf 330. It leaves it pretty open-ended if he did die, did he just fall to the Black Rage? Which, by the way, even if he did just fall to the Black Rage and is like considered dead, he would probably have died in the devastation of Baal when Dante lets out all of the Death Company against the Tyranids. But this is pretty convoluted already, so let's move on. Following this campaign, in White Dwarf 258, we would see that the next global campaign for 2001 would be for Warhammer Fantasy, following Be'lakor's antics. In the same issue, we would get the first tease of the ever-controversial Tau Empire, whom if you hadn't noticed were not listed on the forces for Armageddon, not just because they couldn't get there due to their lack of warp travel, although that is also something that's pretty controversial, but because they didn't exist yet. We would also see in the same issue that a battle report is done called the Hunt for Ghazghkull, in which Black Templar forces would engage an Orc force led by the titular war boss, Ghazghkull. And while I don't think every battle report is canon, it should be noted that in this one, spoilers for a battle report from 20 years ago, the Orcs win, and the lore behind this battle report is that it takes place after the Third War for Armageddon. So yeah, Dark Shadows happens, and not doing some in-depth breakdown on that, as it doesn't add anything to the video. Even though it's the same Be'lakor in Fantasy as he is in 40k, because Chaos has literally always been shared, the timeline doesn't correlate in any way that would add to the meat of the video or prove a point. If you check in White Dwarf 263, Be'lakor loses. Cool, right? For the summer of 2002, Games Workshop did a campaign for the at the time newly revamped Race of the Necrons. I say revamped because Necrons had models in 2nd with even some rules, but no codex until now. This campaign is talked about in White Dwarf 271. While scripting this video, I found it odd that Armageddon, Dark Shadows, Eye of Terror, and Storm of Chaos are talked about as these really cool campaigns, but no one talks about how mid this Necron one was. I think this goes to show how much of the modern discussion about Warhammer is done via new stuff that people read as it comes out, or a very lacking secondhand knowledge of the old stuff, especially these White Dwarfs. And this is why when I was making my blog, I found it odd how many really good White Dwarf statements there were that were never talked about until I started actually showing people the arguments for them and that they came from White Dwarf. Then suddenly everybody started knowing that Chaos was always shared and all these other things. Anyways, Storm of Chaos would be alluded to in White Dwarf 272. I'm mentioning this for a possible future video about the twin Chaos campaigns of the mid-2000s. I pair these two up not just thematically, but because Games Workshop seemed to think about them at the same time, but that's just a bit of my tinfoil theory. Anyways, further proving the point that we are in a post-Armageddon landscape, in the battle report within White Dwarf 273, we are told that Ghazghkull's Waaagh is no longer all-conquering. I'm sure some folks will say that this doesn't inherently mean that it's after the Third War for Armageddon. And sure, that's fair, but as we'll see throughout this video, a timeline is clearly being formed here, with two new races being introduced and Chaos preparing for their onslaught. In White Dwarf issue 275, we would see something that might sound familiar for those of you who know either version of the 13th Black Crusade. Just like George Lucas said, they're like poetry, they rhyme. In the next issue, White Dwarf 276, we would return to Armageddon, again, just further cementing the fact that the campaign has ended and the results are canon. In this revisit, the Necrons are on Armageddon, which they weren't the first time because they didn't really exist yet. Be sure to write into Investor Relations at Games Workshop to let them know how this retcon totally ruins 40k. In the same issue of White Dwarf, we would also be told about Ahriman of the Thousand Suns and how he has plans to infiltrate the Black Library. No, not the publishing arm of Games Workshop, but the in-universe location, the one with all the clowns in it. We'd also be told how these plans interact with the Despoiler's 13th Black Crusade. In White Dwarf 277, we would be told that after the Necrons, Tau, Chaos Space Marines, and Demon Hunter codexes, the studio is working on a new codex, Eye of Terror, to codify the events of the 13th Black Crusade. 2 issues later, in White Dwarf 279, we are told explicitly that Eye of Terror will be like Armageddon, but with higher stakes. They also completely gloss over the Necron campaign, which is understandable, even in retrospect. Within the same issue of White Dwarf, we would get a Battlefleet Gothic article, which contrasts the game's normal battles taking place during the Gothic War, or the 12th Black Crusade, against the naval battles of Armageddon. That's right, we're going back to Armageddon. And in this article, they treat both of these campaigns as being historical, as in the past, furthermore cementing the fact that Armageddon is canon now, and it is no longer a current event, but rather a past event. In White Dwarf 280 is where we would really start going into Eye of Terror properly, despite all the foreshadowing we have covered before this, including this bit about the Space Wolves. Within this issue, we would also see the establishment of the forces of order and disorder, which are a lot like the Grand Alliances in Age of Sigmar that everybody seems to think is the boogeyman. To start off this global campaign properly, in White Dwarf 281, we are told that next month we would get more news. Seriously though, we do get more about Eye of Terror in this issue, as I'm sure if we didn't, people would have rioted back in the day. We are told about how Cypher, from the Dark Angels lore, integrates into the story of the 13th Black Crusade. I say story because especially at this point of 40k's history, I do think it was a story and not a setting, as if that's even a coherent thing to say. We have characters that are clearly doing things that take place over time in a galaxy. This is a story, not some sort of like static sandbox or whatever like people pretended it was for years. In White Dwarf 282, we would be told about a set of revelations in regards to the Eye of Terror, which, as I'm writing the script and even recording it, I have no idea what they're supposed to be. I've asked people on Twitter, no one seems to know. They kind of just come out of nowhere. Also, in this same issue, we are told about how Eye of Terror is a culmination of plot threads from several other games. The article then goes on to establish how they hope to make this the largest global campaign they've had, and going over the stakes of the campaign as if they haven't spent years building up to this. I'm sure reading this at the time may have been different from the perspective we have now, though. In the same issue, we would get lore for the Defiler, and for Typhus establishing his motivation for being in this crusade. Well, beyond Abaddon just telling him he has to be there or be square. Eye of Terror would begin by the time White Dwarf 283 hit shelves, this issue containing Index Astartes Wolfen, establishing that this is one of their first appearances in 10,000 years. This same narrative of the first time in 10,000 years is also talked about with the 13th Company as a whole. This issue would also have an article about Creed, but unlike the other people who have been mentioned so far, we don't need to be told why he's involved with the Crusade since he leads the forces on Cadia. So Abaddon comes to him rather than the other way around. In White Dwarf 284, we would get an article saying that Eye of Terror is the future of Warhammer 40k, further on cementing the fact that we are forging the future of this story rather than dictating the past or something like that. In White Dwarf issue 285, we'd be told about the Pathfinders with rail rifles for the Tau Empire, and that the rail rifles are actually experimental, which they won't be in 4th edition, something we will talk about later. We are also told later on in the same issue that every battle for Eye of Terror is forging history, further on cementing the fact that we are telling an ongoing story and not recreating some historical event that has already been covered. In White Dwarf 286, we are told about the battle between Eldrad and Abaddon, which is said to have had happened recently. Now, does this mean it happened before or during the Eye of Terror is a bit hard to say, but nonetheless it is a relatively current event happening. It does play into Creed's story with Eldrad. In the same issue, the Index Astartes is an in-universe report halfway through the Eye of Terror campaign. In issue 287, we would also see the death of Eldrad, not at the hands of Abaddon, mind you. But this may come as a shock for those of you who don't know the ancient lore, but yes, Eldrad did die canonically. This is something that, like Tycho, is kind of glossed over when they retell everything from 5th edition going onwards, a point I will go on to make later in the video. Within this issue, we would also see the conclusion of the Eye of Terror campaign with a Chaos victory. Unlike the modern telling, Cadia was not destroyed. We also got a whole segment of the magazine going over the characters who have been set up so far, like Abaddon, Creed, Cypher, Ahriman, etc., and how or if they even achieved their goals throughout the campaign. Now that Eye of Terror has concluded, we shift into the part of the script where we establish that Eye of Terror is now in the past, and publications going forward will be using the campaign's ending as a canonical event. To start, we have the following issue of White Dwarf, 288. Now to be clear, I don't think everything published ever is now after Eye of Terror, but rather from a meta perspective, the now has been moved past the 13th Black Crusade, as it is over. Games Workshop, of course, does do historical events all the time, as I'm sure we've covered with the many returns to Armageddon, or how they talk about campaigns in the future, like this one in White Dwarf 339. To reiterate on the meta perspective point, so in 9th edition there were a load of campaigns, but not all of them were in the present. And the present ones we would get were like Arcs of Omen, where we were told this is the forefront of the lore, with Lionel Johnson coming back at the end. In White Dwarf issue 290, we would revisit Armageddon again. Thankfully, they spare us the details that we could read elsewhere, but nonetheless they establish that it took place in the past. We would also see the recently ended Eye of Terror pop up again, to allow people to run their own campaigns in White Dwarf issues 291 and 292. Thankfully, with White Dwarf issue 293, we are into Storm of Chaos, a fantasy event, which means that the note-taking won't be as severe, as we can kind of zoom forward to 4th edition's release. What do you mean I have another project that involves Storm of Chaos? Whatever, I'll do that later. With the onset of 4th edition, we would see a common thread moving forward. In White Dwarf, they would talk about how all the lore will be contained within one book now, rules are moving forward, and when we look at the core rulebook, we would see that certain historical events, like the Age of Apostasy or the Gothic War, have a time frame at the top of the page which goes over a start and an end date. However, for some events, like the Horus Heresy, it will just say circa M31. We would get a page about the Black Crusades with an end date of 999 M41, along with the text on the page flat out talking about it being over. We would then get a similar page for Armageddon, but even more damning, showing that the lore has moved forward here, would be a page about the Tyrannic Wars, which shows that they aren't over and the era lasts until the present. This is supported by White Dwarf 305, where we were told that only now at the close of the 41st millennium do the Great Devourer's jaws close around the galaxy. In White Dwarf 308, we would see a return to Eye of Terror. Thank God, Armageddon was getting really stale at this point, not gonna lie. Especially since around this time Games Workshop relaunched Epic as Epic Armageddon. I don't know why they did that, but whatever. Anyways, I think you all know the drill now, where Eye of Terror is referred to as a past event. In White Dwarf 311, we would learn about the Dark Eldar raids on the Iron Hands homeworld of Medusa following the 13th Black Crusade. In White Dwarf 312, we would again return to Armageddon. Oh boy, with it being referred to as the past, as I'm sure is just canon at this point and it shouldn't be arguable. Something that is getting old even though it keeps proving me right. Also, Tycho is still dead. So on to Medusa 5. We go to the next global campaign, which, oddly enough, this campaign, or rather planet, was kind of foreshadowed in White Dwarf 312. Although our first real bit of information about the campaign would come in White Dwarf 315. You might want to put an asterisk on that, since the advertising for the Medusa 5 campaign in issue 314. And then here's the advertisement in 315. I know the first one says Dark Stars, but Dark Stars is like a prelude to Medusa 5, as we can deduce, and is outright stated in White Dwarf 327. Which is odd, because they reused the name in White Dwarf 326. I guess like Indomitus, they just really like the name. In White Dwarf 316, we would see that some of the letters sent out from Medusa 5 that talk about the conflict were sent out at 999M41, along with establishing all the motivations for the factions involved. Following this, the next few issues of White Dwarf would basically just be battle reports, explaining how the various staff at Games Workshop are making forces for the campaign, with the campaign itself eventually finishing to little fanfare. Like, there wasn't really an article in White Dwarf highlighting it or anything, we kind of just have to go off the website, which you can only really access now with the Wayback Machine. This is kind of an issue with the post-Eye of Terror campaigns, as it kind of happen in person, and then you never really hear about the ending to it. Like, there's like the Fate of Conor in 8th, and the Tyranids one in 10th, and if you weren't around at the time, you kind of just don't know about them because they aren't documented very well, unfortunately. Anyways, now that we have the backstory behind the campaigns and establishing that they are pushing the canon forward, there's a few more articles we have to get out of the way before we can talk about the big juicy retcon coming up with 5th edition. In White Dwarf 333, we would see a battle report that is at the bare minimum concurrent with Eye of Terror. So when 5th edition was coming out, we were told in White Dwarf 343 that due to GW adding so much to the current timeline of Warhammer 40k, they were going to focus on this current timeline, which they have now called the Time of Ending. The Time of Ending is the past 250 years, which includes the Tyrannic Wars, all the way through to the 13th Black Crusade, and a new event teased in the same issue, the Golden Throne failing. With no mention of Medusa 5 as this event post-Eye of Terror or anything like that, it's pretty clear that we've taken a step back from M42 for the time being. This is the subject of the video, what I believe to be the biggest retcon in Warhammer's history, where we walk back the events of 2 global campaigns only to retell them over the course of 10 years leading up to 8th edition. Now this wouldn't be the last timeline retcon, as in recent memory we had the Dark Imperium errata, so that the Indomitus Crusade is no longer over. Genuinely speaking, I think this is the biggest retcon because it does beg a lot of questions when reading stuff from 5th edition onwards, and how canon they would be. In practice, there are very few things that should outright be not canon, and that is only because of glaring contradictions, like the statement about Abaddon not destroying Cadia. Anyways guys, that's been it for this video. If you enjoy Warhammer content, please subscribe. I hope to be making more in the future.